In a helicopter hanging in the air, a nurse faces the impossible, doing open-heart surgery on her own son. With storms around, ropes, and an improvised team, her love and vocation become the only hope. It is a story of courage, sacrifice, and fighting against destiny. The sunrise always came with the same ritual inside the hospital. The cold lights of the hallways competed with the first rays of sun that slipped shyly through the high windows. Windows that only showed a small piece of the sky. Nurses walked quickly through the halls with low voices, while the smell of disinfectant filled every corner. A constant reminder that life and death lived side by side there. In the break room, coffee cups lined up like tired soldiers, some half-drunk, others forgotten with cold liquid inside. Doctors reviewed medical records, some still with marks on their faces from the night shift masks. The air was heavy with exhaustion, but also with habit. Everyone knew that this routine, even if hard, was also a shield against the unexpected. She, the nurse at the center of this story, walked down the hall with steady steps. Her white uniform reflected the first light of day, and although her face showed signs of fatigue, her eyes carried a strange calm. She was used to this rhythm. Checkups, medication, notes in patient files, forced smiles for those waking up with uncertainty in their eyes. Each action seemed mechanical, a sequence repeated so many times she no longer needed to think. But deep inside, there was a tension she couldn't ignore. That morning was not like the others. Even though she tried to stay calm and stick to her routine, a feeling ran through her body. A feeling that made her hands tremble slightly, as if her instincts already knew what was coming. In the waiting room, the clocks showed 6:30. The low voices of patients arriving early filled the space with a mix of anxiety and resignation. Outside, traffic was starting to clog the streets, and ambulances cut the morning calm with sirens that sounded like distant cries. She looked at it all with her usual clinical eye. But that morning every detail seemed sharper, stronger, as if the world wanted to print itself into her memory. The nurse took a deep breath. Her thoughts went to her son, still sleeping at home, unaware of the hospital's rush. She remembered his calm face, the way he hugged his favorite stuffed animal, and the fragility of his young body. Thinking of him gave her strength, but also a weight in her chest, as if the hospital routine and her child's life were tied by an invisible thread. That feeling grew when suddenly, an urgent message sounded through the hospital speakers. For some, it was just a routine call, but for her it was like an alarm bell. She didn't know why, but she felt it marked the start of something different, something that would break forever the eternal mornings of the hospital. The day had barely begun, but already there was a tension that seemed to warn that routine was about to turn into something extraordinary. And in that cold hallway, under artificial light and the echo of hurried steps, she was unknowingly getting ready to face the greatest challenge of her life. The hospital hallway was left behind as she walked toward the room where her shift began. Her white coat rustled softly with each step, and though she walked firmly, her mind was divided. Because beyond being a nurse, with all the responsibilities that came with it, she was a mother. And being a mother was not something that turned off with a uniform. It was a constant voice that followed her in every gesture and every thought. During the first hours of the day, she reviewed files, set up IVs, and calmed patients with gentle words. But in every face she saw reflections of her son. The little girl crying from fear of an injection reminded her of the boy at home who was afraid of the dark. The old man asking for water in a weak voice brought back the nights when her son woke up asking for a glass of warm milk. It was as if motherhood shaped the way she cared, making her more human but also more vulnerable. It wasn't easy. Night shifts, sudden emergencies, and endless hours on her feet often kept her away from home. There were mornings when she came back from work with red, tired eyes, and still had to smile at her son, hiding under a calm appearance all the weight of her shift. Her vocation had led her to heal lives, But that same vocation forced her to live in two worlds that rarely came together. Even so, she had learned to find balance. In the hospital halls, she carried a small drawing her son had made. A crooked sun and a red heart with the word Mom written in messy letters. That folded paper was her lucky charm, the strength she needed when fatigue was about to defeat her. And at home, when she played with her son on the carpet or held him when he was sick, she stayed silent about everything she had seen in the hospital. The losses, the pain, the desperate cries. She didn't want his childhood world stained with those shadows. That double weight, however, was also a source of strength. Motherhood taught her to give warmer, more human care, and nursing gave her the discipline and calm needed to face the hardships that every mother knows. She understood medicine and diagnoses, but also hugs and lullabies, and in that mix she found her true identity. Not only a mother, not only a nurse, but both at the same time. That morning, as she arranged supplies at the nursing station, she thought about how every decision inside the hospital could mean a life. That responsibility, already huge by itself, became even heavier when she thought that someday it could be her son who needed that care. And the fear hidden deep inside began to surface. What would she do if destiny ever forced her to bring together her two worlds, motherhood and nursing, into a single act? She couldn't answer that question. The idea was too hard, too unlikely. But the strange feeling she had carried since sunrise did not go away. On the contrary, it grew, like an inner whisper warning her that soon she would have to face that test. The clock on the wall showed 8 in the morning. The hospital kept its usual routine, but for her, time felt different. Every second seemed filled with invisible weight, as if her life was moving toward an inevitable crossing. For now, she could only hold on to what she knew, to care, to listen, to heal, and hope that life would not ask her for more than she had already given. The day at the hospital seemed to move forward like any other. Between paperwork, checkups, and hurried voices, the nurse tried to lose herself in the routine so that strange feeling would fade. But it stayed with her, like a shadow that refused to leave. She didn't know yet that, by the end of her shift, the world she tried so hard to keep in balance would break apart. When she returned home that afternoon, the usual tiredness turned into something else. As soon as she opened the door, she ran to her son, who greeted her with an innocent smile, the kind that always erased her fatigue. The boy held onto her neck tightly, as if he sensed how much he needed her. That's when she noticed. His breathing was faster than normal, and when she set him down to watch him run across the room, a light dizziness forced him to stop. With her trained nurse's eyes, she knew at once this wasn't simple childhood tiredness. The next days became a sequence of doctor visits, tests, and long hours of waiting in hallways that, for the first time, placed her on the other side. She was no longer the nurse calming families, but the mother waiting for news, searching for hope in the doctor's expressions. Each tick of the clock sounded louder, as if time itself was crushing her. The diagnosis came in an office lit by white light that felt too cold for the weight of the words about to be spoken. The pediatric cardiologist, calm but firm, explained that her son's heart had a severe malformation. It was not something that could be treated with medicine or routine care. It was a structural problem that could only be fixed with open-heart surgery. She felt the blood freeze in her veins. She had witnessed countless devastating diagnoses before, had held the trembling hands of parents receiving such news. But she had never imagined being in their place. The ground seemed to vanish under her feet, and still she tried to keep her composure, as if the professional inside her was trying to protect the mother being torn apart. The doctor kept talking about percentages, risks, and critical time frames. Each word hit her like a blow, but the most painful was hearing that time was limited. Her son's condition did not allow for waiting. The surgery had to be done soon, or his heart could stop before even reaching his 10th birthday. In her mind, images overlapped. She saw her son playing with his stuffed toy, drawing crooked suns on paper, and then imagined him in an operating room, surrounded by scalpels and cold machines. The contradiction broke her. Her maternal instinct screamed to protect him from all pain, while her professional knowledge confirmed there was no escape. That night at home, the silence was unbearable. The boy slept peacefully, unaware of the heavy truth, while she watched him as if every breath was a treasure. She touched his chest softly, feeling the weak and irregular beats she now knew too well. She promised herself she would not let that heart stop, even if it meant giving everything she was and everything she had. The next morning found her awake, with deep shadows under her eyes, but a decision forming inside her. She knew the path ahead was not ordinary. Life had placed her face to face with the challenge she had feared most: to unite her vocation and her motherhood into a single battle. And she was ready to fight it, no matter the cost. The news didn't stay locked inside that cold, bright office. Soon it turned into meetings, more detailed studies, and endless conversations among specialists. The mother nurse attended each one, not only as a worried parent, but also as a colleague who fully understood every term, every awkward silence, every doubtful look on the doctors' faces. The first medical meetings were filled with charts and X-rays projected on screens, showing the small outline of the boy's heart, twisted by the malformation. They spoke of faulty valves, irregular blood pressure, and risks of sudden collapse. Every technical explanation came with a "but." We could try this procedure, but the chance of failure is extremely high. There's another technique, but it requires equipment we don't have in this hospital. The room filled with alternatives that collapsed before they could become real hope. She listened with arms crossed, eyes fixed, as if holding on to her professional side could stop the mother inside her from falling apart. But inside, every word was a whip. She knew that behind the calm way the doctor spoke, there was fear. None of them wanted to take on such a huge risk with such a small patient. The line between science and faith grew thinner every day. In one meeting, an experienced surgeon said it clearly: "We can try it here, but the chances of success are minimal. The best option would be to transfer him to a specialized center for complex pediatric surgery. But time is what we don't have." That sentence hung in the air, heavy, like a verdict that couldn't be undone. The mother nurse felt her heart break in two. She knew what a transfer meant: bureaucracy, costs, travel risks, endless paperwork. And every day lost could be the last. She looked into the doctor's eyes, searching for conviction, but found only resignation disguised as caution. In the hospital hallways, people spoke in low voices. Some co-workers avoided her, knowing what was at stake and not wanting to be the ones to say the inevitable. Others offered comfort with words that felt empty. She thanked them, nodded, but deep down she knew no words could soften the truth. Medicine was reaching its limit. The nights grew long. At home, sitting by her son's bed, she replayed every protocol, every surgical technique she had seen in her career. She thought of the equipment, the scalpels, the monitors, the tiny stitches that could give that small heart a chance. And then she understood the cruelty of it all. She had the knowledge, but not the means or the setting to use it. It was like being trapped between two worlds that refused to meet. One day, exhausted from so many back and forths, she asked for a private meeting with the main cardiologist. She didn't speak as a colleague, but as a mother. "Tell me the truth," she begged. "If it were your child, what would you do?" The doctor looked at her in silence for several seconds before answering. "I'd look for a miracle, because science alone is not enough." That answer was neither relief nor condemnation. It was a mirror of what she already felt. The limits of medicine had been reached. Destiny seemed to place her at a crossroads with no manual, no protocol. And as she stroked her son's forehead that afternoon, she understood she could no longer wait for others to decide. Sooner or later, the choice would be hers alone. The nurse had not been able to sleep that night. The walls of her room felt like the hospital walls, full of invisible pressures surrounding her. On one side was the oath she had taken years ago, when she chose to dedicate her life to saving others, to healing with her knowledge and experience. An ethical commitment that had always guided her career. But on the other side was her son, the little being she had brought into the world with love and care, her greatest reason to live, who was now standing on the edge of death. She woke before the sun fully lit the room. The air felt heavy, almost unbearable. Every part of her was in conflict. She knew that as a nurse she had the responsibility to do everything possible to save her son's life. But how much could she get emotionally involved? Could she risk her professional objectivity when the patient was someone she loved with all her heart? While she got ready for work, those questions tormented her, and the pain grew stronger. Her hands trembled as she buttoned her uniform, and she felt split in two. When she arrived at the hospital, the hallways seemed longer than ever. Even though she tried to follow the routine, everything looked like it was moving in slow motion, as if the world was reminding her at every step of the hard decision waiting ahead. She entered the nursing station with her head full of doubts. Her face no longer showed the calm that had marked her years on the job. Co-workers greeted her as always, but she couldn't shake off the feeling that everything had become confusing. Every look, every greeting, reminded her that the lives she saved each day at work were nothing compared to what she was living at home. Throughout the day, her thoughts overwhelmed her. She knew the doctors had done all they could to give her options, but none of them seemed enough. In the last medical meeting, they had repeated once again that her son's surgery was extremely risky. On one side, her professional knowledge told her they had to try everything possible. But on the other, her motherly love screamed that she could lose him, that she didn't want him to suffer. The Hippocratic Oath told her that emotions should never cloud her judgment. As a professional, she was supposed to make decisions based on science, weighing risks and benefits with cold logic. But when it came to her son, those limits blurred. How could she keep professional distance when it was the life of the person she loved most in the world? That afternoon, tired of endless discussions and medical approaches, the nurse went to her office for a break. She closed the door and allowed herself to cry for the first time since it all began. She knew she had to keep a strong face for others, but there alone, she let the built-up tension explode into silent sobs. Her rational mind tried to bring order, but the pain of a mother was too strong, drowning out all logic. When she stood up, she looked at herself in the mirror. She was exhausted, but also felt stronger than ever. She knew her son's destiny rested in her hands, not only as a mother, but also as a nurse. The weight of both roles was unbearable, but she realized she couldn't give up either one. It was no longer only about saving a patient. It was about doing what was right, about fighting for what could still be saved. The hours at work passed, and as her shift neared its end, she decided she could not keep delaying the choice. The medical world was full of protocols and rules, but she understood something she had never fully grasped before. The commitment to life is not only in science. Sometimes, the true vocation of a healer and of a human being lies in challenging those rules, in using humanity as the light to guide the hardest decisions. The tension built up in those endless medical meetings finally reached a breaking point. After days of doubts, tests, and calculations that always led to the same dead end, the nurse realized the only option was the one no one dared to say out loud. In one of the rooms, while the specialists argued about the lack of resources and the risks of transfer, she stood up with a determination that shocked everyone. "If we can't do it in an operating room, then we'll have to do it anywhere we have the chance to try." Her words hung in the air. Silence became heavy. Some doctors looked at her with disbelief, others with pity, as if she had lost her mind. But in her eyes there was a conviction that left no doubt. It wasn't an impulsive statement. It was the conclusion of a mother and a professional who had gone over every alternative, who had seen the clock ticking mercilessly, and who knew her son could not wait any longer. At first, the proposal was rejected right away. A surgery of that size needs an operating room, specialized equipment, sterile conditions, said one of the surgeons. She nodded, but replied firmly, "That's true. But while we argue about the impossible, my son is dying." The room froze at the blunt force of her words. In the hours that followed, the idea that seemed absurd began to take shape in quiet conversations. Some colleagues, moved by desperation and by respect for her courage, started thinking about what minimum conditions could be recreated for such a procedure. Someone mentioned portable emergency kits. Another remembered that air rescue units carried basic surgical supplies for critical situations. Suddenly, what once looked like madness started to appear possible. The mother nurse knew she couldn't wait for a miracle from outside. The real miracle had to be forged with her own hands. If her son's life was hanging by a thread, she was ready to hold on to that thread, even if it was in the void. That's when the unexpected call came. The only possible transfer was by helicopter, but a coming storm would make landing at the destination hospital impossible. The pilot explained that if the flight succeeded, they would have to stay suspended in the air, held by a rope, until the weather allowed them to descend. At that moment, the impossible proposal became reality. She understood it as soon as she heard the pilot's voice. The surgery would have to be done in the air, under conditions that defied all medical logic. There would be no white room, no surgical lamps, only wind, constant movement, the roar of blades, and the dizzying height. That night, as she packed a small bag with the essentials, she watched her son sleeping. His innocent face seemed unaware of the storm ahead. She stroked his hair and swore to herself she would do the impossible. She would not let destiny take her son without fighting until her last breath. She knew that by accepting this challenge, she was defying not only science but nature itself. The impossible proposal had become the only path. There were no guarantees, only the certainty that doing nothing meant death. The nurse held on to that truth like an anchor, even though she knew she was about to leap into an abyss from which there might be no return. The sunrise that day came with a strange silence, different from normal mornings. There was no calm in the hospital hallways, only a heavy tension, as if everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen. She walked with steady steps, though inside every heartbeat was mixed with fear. The impossible proposal was no longer just an idea. It was becoming real with the distant roar of helicopter blades. At first it was only a faint hum, almost lost in the wind. Then it grew louder, deeper, until it became a thunder that made the windows shake. The helicopter was approaching, carrying with it the thin line between hope and the abyss. Patients waiting in the emergency room looked toward the sky through the windows, surprised by the noise. Some crossed themselves, others whispered questions. For them, it was only another machine, but for her, it meant all or nothing. The mother nurse held her son's hand. He looked at her with big, frightened eyes. She tried to smile, hiding the storm inside her. "Everything will be fine," she whispered, knowing those words were not promises but prayers. The boy hugged his stuffed toy tightly, as if he knew this trip would be unlike any other. At the helipad, the air was different. The wind lifted the dust and made their coats flap like flags in battle. Flight technicians ran back and forth, securing the equipment, while the pilot shouted quick instructions, his voice almost lost in the noise. The doctors exchanged doubtful looks. They knew this was far from any known protocol, but no one dared stop her now. The determination in her eyes was stronger than any scientific argument. They boarded the helicopter in the middle of the roaring wind. She carefully held her son, helping him settle into the safety straps. Paramedics handed over improvised instruments. Scalpels sterilized in haste, gauze, clamps, and a small portable monitor whose weak beeping seemed like a cruel joke against the thunder of the blades. The nurse reviewed every step of the surgery in her mind, trying to burn the plan into memory like a script she would have to perform under the most extreme conditions. When the blades reached full speed, the sound became deafening. The helicopter rose slowly, and the hospital shrank below them, fading like the known world itself. On the horizon, black clouds announced the storm. The sky offered no mercy. It looked like a stage built to test faith and courage. Inside the cabin, the air vibrated with each strike of the rotor. The crew exchanged silent glances, aware they were part of something no one had thought possible. The nurse closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to hold back tears. She knew that if she broke down now, she would have no strength for what lay ahead. She breathed deeply, remembering the promise she had made at her son's bedside, to fight until the end, even if it meant defying the laws of science and nature. The boy, drowsy from medication, rested his head on her lap. She stroked his hair, trying to take in some of the calm from his small body, even as she knew how fragile the heart inside him truly was. Each beep of the monitor was a cruel reminder of the urgency, of how little time was left. The helicopter pushed forward into the storm, and in the middle of that constant roar, she found a strange inner silence. Everything came down to a single thought. There was no turning back. The last hope was hanging in the air, among dark clouds and strong winds. And there, in that impossible place, a mother and a nurse were about to face destiny with bare hands, and a love that knew no limits. The helicopter was already in the air, moving with determination toward an uncertain destination. From the very first moment, the mother nurse knew there was no room for mistakes. Every vibration of the fuselage, every shake from the wind, was a reminder that time was not on her side. Her son lay strapped in, connected to the small portable monitor that gave out weak, intermittent beeps. The sounds were faint, but enough to remind her that every second mattered. The mission had been organized in just a few hours. There were no full supply lists, no detailed protocols. What they carried was what they had managed to gather in haste. Scalpels sealed in plastic bags, gauze, clamps, syringes with minimal doses of anesthesia, and a small metal box with sutures. Far too few for such a complex procedure. The pilot had agreed only on the condition that landing at the destination hospital would not be possible due to the storm. The only option was to remain in the air and wait. That limitation made the operation more than difficult. It made it nearly impossible. The improvised team was made up of whoever circumstance had allowed. A paramedic held the supply bag like it was treasure. A young nurse, assigned at the last minute, tried to stay calm despite her pale face. And the assigned doctor, though experienced, couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. He knew that the real responsibility rested more on the woman holding the child than on any of them. Outside, the sky darkened. The clouds closed in like a curtain falling over the mission stage. The pilot reported now and then about wind speed and the turbulence ahead. Every word confirmed what everyone feared. The storm wouldn't wait. They had only minutes to decide whether to begin the surgery or risk the boy's life waiting for the weather to clear. The mother nurse didn't need anyone to explain. She knew her son's body, every symptom. She saw his face grow paler, felt him shiver in a way that wasn't normal. The monitor confirmed what her instincts already knew. His heart was failing faster than expected. Time was running out. She leaned toward the doctor, her voice barely audible over the roar of the blades. "We can't wait. If we don't operate now, he won't make it to the hospital." The doctor hesitated. He looked at the tools, the cramped space, his hands shaking with the constant motion of the aircraft. "It's too risky," he managed to say. She cut him off with a firmness that froze everyone. "Risky is doing nothing." The cabin fell silent. The pilot, focused on holding the course, said nothing. He knew this wasn't his decision, but he could feel the weight of every word. The young nurse began preparing the instruments clumsily, as if her hands themselves resisted accepting that this was really happening. The mother nurse laid her son onto an improvised stretcher in the middle of the cabin. She held his small body firmly and whispered in his ear, "I'll be with you the whole time. Don't be afraid." The boy, half asleep from the medication, managed only a faint nod. His stuffed toy was placed at his side, standing as a silent guardian over the scene. The air grew heavy, filled with expectation. Everyone in the team knew they were part of something unprecedented. The cabin smelled of metal, sweat, and hastily applied disinfectant. Outside, lightning flashed through the clouds, lighting up the cabin with brief bursts that felt like a countdown to the final moment. As they prepared the gauze and checked the small supply of anesthesia, the mother nurse thought of everything she had learned in her career. It wasn't the first time she had seen an open heart, but never in the body of her own child. That difference changed everything. Even so, there was no doubt in her mind. The mission was clear: improvise, endure, and above all, save him. The helicopter pressed forward, but for those inside, the outside world no longer mattered. The cabin had become an operating room suspended in the sky. The boy's life was hanging by a thread, and the only hope was the impossible mission being written in that very moment. The helicopter moved forward with difficulty, and though the inside had turned into an improvised operating room, the danger came not only from the lack of proper equipment or the boy's fragile condition. Outside, the sky was closing fast. The gray horizon turned black in minutes, like a heavy curtain falling over the aircraft. The roar of the blades now competed with thunder rolling in the distance. The nurse held her son's hand tightly while watching the pilot's tense jaw. His eyes, fixed on the controls, showed the strain of someone flying against both time and nature. A lightning bolt split the sky, lighting up the cabin for a second and revealing everyone's tense faces. No one spoke. Words were useless when the wind hit the aircraft so hard it felt like they might lose control at any moment. The doctor looked at the nurse with concern. "If the turbulence gets worse, we can't continue." She cut him off before he finished. "We don't have a choice. My son's heart won't wait for the storm to pass." The portable monitor gave off an uneven beep, as if confirming her words. The boy's heartbeat was growing more erratic. The paramedic tried to steady the tools on a metal tray that shook without pause. The young nurse, pale and frightened, clutched the sutures and gauze as if it was up to her to stop them from flying around the cabin. Suddenly, a powerful gust shook the helicopter. The boy's body trembled on the improvised stretcher, and the nurse covered him with her arm instinctively to protect him. The pilot shouted over the chaos, "Hold on! The storm is right on top of us." Cold drops of rain forced their way through small cracks in the structure, carrying the smell of earth and dampness. Fear filled the cabin, though no one dared say it out loud. The nurse, however, refused to let terror freeze her. In the middle of the chaos, her mind locked onto one goal: stay calm, because her son needed her to be the only one who did not shake. Seconds stretched into eternities. The helicopter rose and dropped sharply, tossed like a leaf in a storm. The pilot made quick maneuvers to dodge the thickest clouds, but each turn brought new jolts that sent instruments crashing against the walls. At one point, a tray slid dangerously toward the floor, and the paramedic dove to catch it before they lost the few sterile supplies they had. The nurse felt faith and science mix inside her. She remembered all her emergency training, all the endless nights in wards filled with critical patients, but nothing compared to this. No protocol could protect them from the storm. Only human will, her love as a mother, and the skill of the team could hold up the impossible. Despite the deafening roar of the wind, she leaned toward her son and whispered, "Don't be afraid. We're in this together." The boy, weak, opened his eyes for only a few seconds. His lips trembled, as if trying to form a word, but he slipped back into a sigh. The monitor answered with a sharp drop in its reading that froze everyone's blood. The doctor clenched his teeth and murmured, "We can't wait any longer. If we don't start now, no surgery will save him." The nurse nodded, her hands steady even as the helicopter shook violently. The storm was not just an obstacle in the sky. It was the symbol of the limit they had reached. Science, nature, and fate all seemed to be working against them. And still, she decided she would not give in. The operation would have to begin in the very heart of the storm. The storm roared like an angry beast, and every second in the air was a fight for survival. The helicopter shook from side to side, like a toy in the hands of the wind. Lightning flashed across the cabin in blinding bursts, while thunder crashed and rain hammered non-stop against the metal frame. The pilot, his face dripping with sweat, kept both hands tight on the controls, his eyes calculating every move with precision. Suddenly, his voice broke the tense silence inside the cabin. "There's no way to land. The runway is flooded, and the wind won't let us descend. We can only stay in the air." His words fell like a hammer on the group. The young nurse swallowed hard, the paramedic gripped the stretcher to stay balanced, and the doctor closed his eyes for a second, as if searching for strength deep within himself. But the mother nurse received the news with a calmness that surprised everyone. She had already accepted that the impossible was the only way forward. The pilot continued, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. "We can stay in the air a few more minutes, but not much. Fuel is limited, and this weather won't give us a break. If you're going to do it now." That sentence, more than an order, was the confirmation of what she had already decided. She bent over her son, checking the monitor, its beeps now uneven and frightening. His small body looked fragile under the flickering light of the lightning outside. There was no time left for doubt or second opinions. "We'll do it here," she said firmly, looking at the doctor. He hesitated, fully aware that any mistake could mean immediate death. But the determination in her eyes left no room for objection. Beside them, the young nurse began to prepare the instruments with trembling hands, while the paramedic held onto the metal tray that shook with every violent movement of the aircraft. The helicopter, hovering in the storm, had become an operating room. The cabin vibrated with each gust of wind, and the noise was so deafening they could barely hear one another. Even so, the nurse managed to stay in control. Her breathing slowed, steady, as if every breath was an act of resistance against the chaos surrounding them. The pilot gave one last warning. "I can't promise you stability. This aircraft wasn't built for this. But I'll give you all the time I can." The mother nurse nodded, never taking her eyes off her son. At that moment, she no longer saw the storm, the helicopter, or the tense faces around her. She saw only her child's fragile chest, and the certainty that she would have to open it to give him a chance to live. The doctor, resigned, began to organize the tasks. "I'll handle the clamps. You take the scalpel." She gripped the instrument firmly. It wasn't the first time she had done this, but never before had it carried this kind of weight. Outside, lightning continued to light up the cabin, as if the sky itself wanted to witness the act of defiance. The helicopter hovered, fighting the storm. They were trapped between sky and earth, in a place where nothing was safe and everything was at stake. Fate had placed them there, suspended in the air, forcing them to face the unthinkable. And the mother nurse, with the scalpel in hand and her heart on fire, was ready to cross that line. The helicopter shook violently, unable to steady itself in the middle of the storm. The cabin was boiling with noise. The engine roared, the blades cut the air like knives, and the wind slammed the sides so hard it felt like it would tear the aircraft apart. The mother nurse, scalpel in hand, knew that every jolt could turn into tragedy. It was impossible to keep the precision needed to open her son's chest under those conditions. The doctor tried to hold the instruments, but the metal tray slid from side to side. The paramedic fought to keep the monitor upright, while the young nurse, tears in her eyes, could barely hold the sutures without them tangling with the safety straps. The scene was chaos, yet they all knew time was running out. The boy's heart was failing. The irregular beeps of the monitor sounded like a countdown. Then the pilot, without looking away from the controls, shouted a desperate idea. "We can drop a few meters and open the hatch. With the safety harness, someone could go out and hang on. Outside, with less vibration, there'd be more stability to work." His words exploded in the air. No one answered at first. The idea sounded insane. The doctor shook his head, horrified. "That's suicide. The wind out there could rip anyone away in seconds." But the nurse understood instantly. The pilot was right. Inside the cabin, there was no way to perform the surgery with the precision needed. Outside, hanging from a rope, she might at least have a chance. It was an impossible gamble, but it was also the only one that could give her son even the slightest hope. The doctor tried to stop her. "You can't do this. You're his mother." She looked at him with pain, but also with unshakable resolve. "That's exactly why I must do it." The decision was made. The pilot lowered the aircraft slightly to ease the force of the wind. The crew fastened a harness around the nurse's waist, checking each knot twice. The sound of the metal hooks locking in place felt like the start of a battle against death itself. The paramedic tried to hide the fear in his eyes, while the young nurse held the boy's hand as if she could pass her strength into him. With one last look at her son, the mother nurse bent close and whispered into his ear, though he was unconscious, "Don't leave me. Hold on with me." The hatch opened, and the storm's fury rushed inside. The icy air cut at their skin, and the noise was so overwhelming they could barely hear each other. With one decisive move, she let herself swing into the void, held only by the rope that tied her to the helicopter. Out there, the world was different. The wind swung her like a pendulum, and below stretched a black abyss. But her hands did not shake. She held the scalpel as if she held fate itself, and in her eyes was a mix of fear and courage that defied all reason. The doctor leaned out from the hatch, passing instruments to her carefully. The paramedic pressed the tray against the floor, and the young nurse inside kept her eyes locked on the boy, watching every change on the monitor. It was teamwork in the most inhuman conditions, and yet they all clung to hope that it might work. Suspended in the air, the mother nurse made a decision that broke every limit. She would open her son's chest right there, hanging from a rope, defying the storm and the abyss. The whole world seemed to shrink into that single moment, into that rope that held her, and that small heart that had to beat again. The nurse's body swung in the air like a pendulum, held only by the rope that tied her to the helicopter. The wind lashed against her, soaking her face with cold drops of rain that seeped through every seam of her uniform. The storm roared around her, but she could not give in to fear. In her mind, everything was reduced to one thought: prepare to open her son's chest. Inside the cabin, the open hatch let in bursts of wind that shook everything. The doctor, moving clumsily but with determination, arranged the tools on a metal tray strapped down with belts. Each instrument looked small compared to the size of the task. Scalpels flashing when lightning split the sky, clamps rattling like fragile bells, gauze clinging to the metal so it wouldn't blow away. Nothing was in ideal condition, and yet it was all they had. The paramedic checked the tiny supply of anesthesia. It was so little that it seemed almost absurd to think of such a major surgery with so few resources. The young nurse clutched the sutures and needles in her hands, gripping them as if they were the last defense against the chaos threatening to snatch them away. Everyone on the team was at the limit, but all of them knew the decision was made. There was no other choice but to improvise. Hanging in the air, the mother nurse stretched her hand toward the hatch. The doctor carefully passed her a box of gauze, then the clamps, making sure nothing slipped in the wind. She received each item with precision, as if the rope swinging her back and forth didn't exist, as if the dizzying void had no power over her. The storm could roar with all its fury, but her hands were steady, trained through years of practice in critical moments. With each step, she followed a ritual of control. She sterilized what she could with the few resources available, checked that the scalpel was sharp, arranged the clamps in the order her mind knew by heart. There was no flat surface, no safe tray. She used her own thigh, secured by the harness, as an improvised table. The dizziness was constant, but she ignored it, focused only on turning the little they had into enough. Then the young nurse shouted over the noise. "The monitor shows a drop in blood pressure. We're losing him." The uneven beeping of the device confirmed it. The boy was reaching a critical point. There was no time left. The mother nurse lifted her eyes toward the doctor at the hatch and shouted firmly, "Pass me the scalpel." He hesitated for only a moment, but the determination in her eyes forced him to act. The scalpel shone under a flash of lightning as she took it. It was a symbol of the impossible. A tiny tool turned into the last hope to cut a path between life and death. She held it tightly and breathed deeply. The wind kept swinging her body. The dizziness was overwhelming, and one wrong move could ruin everything. But she had learned to steady her hands in crisis, and now that skill was the only thing that could keep her son alive. She leaned toward the improvised stretcher secured near the hatch and looked at the small body lying there. The boy seemed more fragile than ever, his skin pale, his lips turning blue. Each beep of the monitor was weaker than the last. Time had become a ruthless enemy, and the surgery had to begin now. The mother nurse set the gauze in place, prepared the sutures, and clipped the clamps to her harness so they wouldn't fly away. Every detail mattered. There was no room for error. There would be no second chance. Everything had to succeed on the first try, in the middle of the wind, the rain, and the dizzying void. The pilot called out quickly from his seat. "I'll keep the aircraft as steady as I can, but I can't promise anything." She didn't answer. There was no space for distraction. In her eyes burned the determination of a mother who refused to give up. The scalpel was in her hand, the improvised tools ready, and her son's heart waiting to be saved. The preparations were finished. The time to act had come. The helicopter hovered in the air, fighting the storm that shook it violently. Outside, the sky was a dark mass cut by lightning, flashes like a camera trying to capture an impossible act. Hanging from the rope, with the scalpel in her hand and the instruments strapped to her harness, the mother nurse leaned over her son's small body. The roar of the blades was deafening, filling every space, every thought. Yet inside herself she searched for silence, something almost unreachable. She needed to hear something far more delicate. The faint heartbeat still resisting in her child's chest. It was not steady, but irregular, a fragile rhythm fading little by little. It was as if the heart refused to give up, but lacked the strength to survive on its own. The portable monitor beeped unevenly. Each sound was slower than the last, the numbers dropping with cruelty. Inside the cabin, the young nurse stared desperately at the screen. The paramedic held the equipment with all his strength, while the doctor fixed his eyes on the woman hanging in the void, knowing that what was about to happen belonged to no manual or known protocol. The mother nurse took a deep breath. She knew opening her son's chest was crossing a line from which there was no return. But she also knew that if she didn't, his heart would stop before they ever touched the ground. Gripped by that certainty, she set the scalpel against his skin, her body swaying in the wind. Her hands stayed firm against the chaos roaring around her. In that moment, lightning lit up the cabin, and for 1 second, everything seemed frozen. The noise outside didn't stop, but she shut it out of her mind. She found the impossible silence she needed. A space where only she, her son, and that fading rhythm existed. The first cut was like a line of fire. The scalpel traced the skin with precision, and blood rose in a thin stream, mixing with the rain. The doctor handed her gauze immediately, and she pressed it down calmly. Every movement was measured, calculated. There was no room for hesitation. The roar of the blades might have been deafening, but her ears focused only on the life she was trying to save. The boy stirred weakly under the minimal anesthesia they had managed to give him. The young nurse sobbed quietly, but kept her eyes locked on the monitor. The uneven beeps went on, slow, faint, but still there. That sound was the guide, the beacon in the middle of the storm. As the opening became clearer, the nurse felt her whole body tighten. The dizziness, the wind, the cold, all of it faded from her awareness. The only thing that mattered was the tiny heart still beating. She saw it pulse faintly under the flickering light, a tired muscle refusing to surrender. It was as if that fragile organ shared the same resistance as she did, a will that would not accept defeat. The silence she found wasn't real, but she had created it inside herself. Outside, the storm kept raging. Inside her mind, everything was still. The scalpel moved forward, clamps were placed, gauze was changed again and again. Each action was a step into the unknown, a dance between life and death, carried out in the air. The doctor, leaning from the hatch, barely dared to breathe. He watched the woman, suspended by a rope, moving with the skill of someone who had no right to fail. She wasn't just a professional applying her training. She was a mother fighting against destiny itself. In the middle of that impossible act, one thought crossed her mind. If she managed to save her son, nothing in life would ever be the same. There would be a before and after to this moment. And as her hands worked firmly, the child's weak heart kept beating, fragile, but alive, like a distant drum refusing to fall silent. Bell sparkles if this story has you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, and leave a like. That helps us keep creating powerful, emotional stories like this one. Raising hands. Now, let's continue. The scalpel was already in her hand, shining under the flashing lightning that cut across the sky. The rope held her suspended, and every jolt of the helicopter reminded her how fragile her position was. Yet her hands did not shake. Her whole body had become an instrument of precision, guided by years of training and by a love stronger than any protocol. The first cut had already opened the way through her son's skin, but the next step was even harder. She had to cut through the sternum, the bone shield that protected the most sacred organ, the heart. Normally, this was done in an operating room with specialized tools. Here, she had only a small portable surgical saw and the clumsy help of a terrified paramedic. Duty forced her forward, but what she was about to do no longer belonged to the world of the human. It was already in the realm of the impossible. From the hatch, the doctor shouted instructions to keep her focused. Slowly. Don't lose control. She nodded, more out of courtesy than need. She knew exactly what she was doing. Every movement was measured to the millimeter, every breath controlled. The roar of the helicopter was deafening, but inside her mind there was an unreal calm. The wind could strike her, the rain could soak her, but nothing could pull her away from that tiny heart still beating weakly. With a steady motion, she pressed the saw against the sternum. The metallic vibration mixed with the roar of the blades, creating a sound that made everyone's skin crawl. The young nurse inside cried quietly as she watched. The paramedic held the instruments with both hands, as if letting go would bring everything crashing down. The pilot, focused on keeping the aircraft steady, knew that every second mattered. At last, the sternum gave way with a dull crack. At that moment, lightning lit up the cabin, and for 1 second they all saw her face clearly, soaked firm, determined. She was no longer just a nurse doing her duty. She was a mother crossing a boundary most people would never even imagine. Cold air rushed into the open wound, and the skin shivered under the contact. She pulled away the blood-soaked gauze and leaned closer to the small cavity now revealed. There, beneath layers of bone and tissue, was the target. Her son's tiny heart, still fighting to go on. The monitor gave a long, alarming beep that made everyone hold their breath. The doctor shouted, "Quick, the clamps!" The paramedic tried to pass them, but the tray shook with the helicopter's movement. She reacted with astonishing speed, catching them before they could fall into the void. With firm hands, she clamped the vessels and applied the right pressure. The heart answered with a faint tremor, like a sigh of resistance. In that instant, the nurse understood she had crossed an irreversible line. This was not an operating room. She did not have the full set of tools, and there was no specialized team. Yet she had opened her son's chest, faced the storm, the vertigo, and the chaos. What she was doing no longer belonged to the rules of medicine, but to the will of a mother refusing to give up. The doctor shouted again from the hatch, "You did it. Now keep going. Don't stop." She didn't answer. She was too focused on the faint heartbeat that still persisted. That fragile rhythm was the border between life and death, and she was the only guardian left to keep it alive. Professional duty had brought her this far, but it was love that gave her the strength to go on. Hanging in the air, swaying like a pendulum in the storm, the mother nurse had crossed the line of what was possible. The first cut had been only the beginning. What came next would be even harder, but it was the only chance. The helicopter hung in the air, battling wind gusts that made it creak as if it might split in two at any moment. Inside the cabin, the scene was unreal. It no longer felt like an air rescue mission, but like a place where the impossible was happening. Everyone present knew they would never witness something like this again in their lives. The mother nurse remained suspended on the rope, her son's chest open before her, working with a focus that defied logic. Her hands moved with surgical precision despite the rain running down her arms and the sudden jolts shaking her in the void. Each time lightning lit up the scene, her silhouette stood out against the storm. Fragile, yet somehow superhuman. The others watched in silence, each trapped in a mix of fear, awe, and respect. The doctor, who had led the decisions until recently, now felt powerless. He was there only as support, passing instruments, suggesting steps, but he knew the outcome wasn't in his hands. That woman, suspended in the storm, was the one holding the line between life and death. The paramedic couldn't look away. He had seen crashes, roadside emergencies, even births under improvised conditions, but never anything like this. His fingers, stiff from holding the metal tray, trembled. Still, he refused to let go. He felt that dropping even a single instrument would betray the faith she had placed in them. The young nurse wept quietly. She tried wiping her tears with the back of her hand, but the wind and rain erased them instantly. Her eyes stayed fixed on the monitor, on every number, every uneven beep. When the boy's heart seemed to weaken, she held her breath. When it picked up even slightly, relief filled her chest. She couldn't stop watching the woman outside, wondering where she found the strength to stay steady in the middle of such madness. Even the pilot, focused on the controls, stole glances over his shoulder. What he saw felt impossible. A mother fighting the storm and the void to save her son. A knot formed in his throat, though he couldn't afford to be distracted. He was risking his life keeping the helicopter in the air, but he knew it was nothing compared to what was happening behind him. Every eye inside the helicopter was fixed on the nurse, as if they were witnessing a miracle being built. This wasn't just a medical procedure. It was pure love taking shape in the most brutal, heartbreaking way. Everyone understood that, even if she failed, no one would ever forget what they had seen that night. The air was heavy with tension. No one spoke more than necessary. Every extra word would have been an interruption to her concentration. Thunder and the roar of the engine created the backdrop of a scene that felt like both a nightmare and an epic. Finally, the doctor whispered to himself, "This isn't medicine. This is something much greater." The young nurse nodded silently, as if those words spoke for all of them. In the middle of the storm, they were witnessing the collision of two worlds, science and love, professional duty and maternal instinct. And they all knew they were watching a woman cross the line between human and beyond human. Meanwhile, the mother nurse stayed focused, unaware of the eyes around her. She wasn't thinking of their fear or admiration. She thought only of her son, of the tiny heart still beating weakly, waiting for her hands to bring it back. The boy's heart was exposed, tiny and fragile, beating unevenly, like a flame struggling not to die out. The mother nurse, hanging from the rope, leaned with precision over the opening, her eyes locked on the tired muscle that held her son's life. There was no room for mistakes, and every movement of her hand was a silent pact with life. Inside the helicopter, the silence of the witnesses contrasted with the storm's roar outside. No one dared to speak. The only sound that mattered was the irregular beep of the monitor. Each long pause made the air in the cabin unbreathable. And each time the beep returned, even weak, relief washed over everyone. She took the first suture. The thread was thin, almost invisible under the shaky light of the portable lamps. She held the needle firmly, as if all her faith as a mother and all her knowledge as a nurse were contained in it. Gently, she guided it through the tissue, repairing what had to be repaired. The rope swung her back and forth, but her hands stayed steady, defying both gravity and fear. Each stitch was a prayer. No words left her lips, but in her mind she repeated silent pleas. "Hold on, don't give up, don't fade away." The wind whipped her face, the rain soaked her uniform, but she never strayed from her mission. She was sewing life itself, joining with needle and thread what nature had damaged and destiny tried to steal. The doctor handed her instruments one by one, following her gestures more than her words. He had stopped giving orders. Leadership no longer rested with him, but with her, the mother suspended in the storm, dictating the rhythm of the procedure. The paramedic held the monitor against his chest, keeping the wires in place so the readings would not fail. The young nurse, trembling, prepared more gauze, wiping away every drop of blood that threatened to blur her vision. With every stitch, the boy's heart seemed to respond, not strongly, but with faint tremors that showed he was still fighting. It was as if he knew his mother was there, literally hanging between life and death, fighting with him and for him. The beeping of the monitor stayed irregular, but it was still there. Each sound was another thread in the invisible net that held them all together. The tension was unbearable. The rope swung with every gust, forcing her to pause for seconds to regain stability. Each pause was torture. She felt time slipping through her fingers, but she always returned again and again, pushing the needle, pulling the thread, as if stitching hope into the storm. Lightning flashed, and for a moment everyone saw the scene clearly. A woman hanging in the air, her hands inside her son's chest, stitching life itself while the storm raged around them. It was an image none of them would ever forget. The doctor murmured, his voice rough, almost trembling. "Every stitch you make is a miracle." She did not answer. She couldn't allow herself distraction. Each stitch demanded all her focus, all her being. It was not only technique, it was pure, absolute love. And as the thread closed the tissue, she felt she was also sewing her own soul, repairing not only a physical heart, but the unbreakable bond between mother and child. At last, she finished the first line of sutures. She stopped for a second to look. The heart was still beating, weak but alive. A spark of hope ran through the cabin. No one dared to cheer. They knew the fight was far from over. But for a moment, They all felt that the impossible could be possible. The mother nurse's hands kept moving with precision, stitching life into every suture. But her body was starting to feel the weight of the effort. The rope swung her without rest. The muscles in her arms burned from constant strain, and the storm's cold seeped into her bones. Exhaustion threatened to break her, but she couldn't give in. Not now. Not while her son's heart was still beating under her fingers. In that exhaustion, memories came. Not planned, not called. Just flashes breaking into her mind through the darkness of the storm. She saw her son as a newborn, tiny in her arms, eyes closed, breathing softly. She remembered the first time she promised him, silently, that she would always protect him, that nothing in the world would harm him as long as she was there. Another memory struck her hard. A sunny afternoon in the park, when he first learned to ride without training wheels. He had fallen, scraping his knees, but she hugged him and said, "You'll always have me to lift you up, even if you fall 1,000 times." Now, hanging in the void, those words returned with brutal weight. That was exactly what she was doing. Lifting him once more, though this fall was the most dangerous of all. As her fingers threaded the needle, another memory washed over her. The night he had a high fever and couldn't sleep. She had held him for hours, singing softly, whispering that everything would be okay. Half asleep, he had murmured, "Mom, you always take care of me." That simple phrase burned in her now like fire. Yes, she had always cared for him, and she would keep doing it, even if it meant hanging from the sky and fighting death itself. The monitor gave a long, alarming beep that pulled her back to the present. The boy's heart fluttered weakly. The young nurse shouted from inside the cabin, his pressures dropping again. She pressed her lips together and breathed deeply. The memories were not just comfort, they were fuel. Every promise she had ever made as a mother became strength in her hands, precision in each stitch and determination not to give in to fatigue. She felt she wasn't alone. Each scene of past love was there, steadying her pulse, reminding her she must keep her vow, never abandon her child. The doctor, watching her, noticed the intensity in her eyes. It wasn't just technical focus anymore. It was something deeper, a light that seemed to come from her very soul. He didn't need to ask what was holding her up. He saw it in her face. This woman was tied to her son not just by blood, but by a bond of love that no storm, no rope, and no impossibility could break. A violent gust spun her in the air, almost ripping the needle from her fingers. She caught it with instinctive reflex. For a second, the abyss below reminded her how fragile it all was. But another image rose in her mind, her son's laughter as he ran toward her with open arms. That memory steadied her more than any harness could. The impossible silence she had built inside herself grew stronger with those memories. Every stitch, every move, was carried by an inner echo. "I promised you, and I will keep my promise." And while the helicopter fought the storm, she fought her exhaustion, fueled by the invisible strength of those past words. The boy's heart responded with a small rise. It wasn't strong, but enough to bring a sigh of relief in the cabin. The young nurse pressed her hands to her chest in silent thanks. The paramedic smiled faintly, still gripping everything tightly. The doctor nodded with respect, knowing this was no longer just a procedure. It was the living proof of a mother's promises. Hanging from the rope, the mother nurse felt tears mix with the rain on her face. They weren't from fear or weakness, but from a love so fierce it kept her standing against the impossible. Time felt frozen inside the helicopter. No one knew how long the mother nurse had been hanging from the rope, facing the storm and the wind, but every second felt endless. Her body was starting to betray her. The muscles in her arms burned like fire. Her legs were numb and barely responded, and the rope rubbed her skin, leaving painful marks with every sway. The exhaustion was brutal, yet she could not stop. Not now. not while her son's heart was still beating under her hands. Her son's weak heartbeat was all that mattered. Each stitch brought a little more hope, but also drained more of her strength. Her breathing grew heavy, her chest rising and falling with effort, her breath turning to mist in the icy air pouring through the open hatch. She knew she was reaching the limit of what her body could endure, but she refused to give in. Fear also pressed in. Every gust that swung her toward the abyss reminded her how easy it would be to lose everything in a second. Vertigo struck her like a blow, forcing her eyes down for a moment, where the darkness stretched below like a hungry mouth ready to swallow her whole. A whisper inside her said it was impossible, that no one could survive like this. But she silenced it with a stronger thought. He's my son, and I will not stop. The doctor leaned from the hatch and saw the tremor in her arms. You need to rest for a moment, he shouted, trying to be heard over the storm and the engine. She shook her head, her face wet with rain and tears. If I stop now, I lose him. The paramedic held the tray so tightly his knuckles turned white. He knew she was at her limit, yet he saw her continue with a precision that defied reason. The young nurse could barely hold back sobs as she passed blood-soaked gauze, amazed that this woman, on the edge of collapse, kept stitching life with every movement. The helicopter jolted violently. The rope flung her to the side, and the scalpel nearly slipped from her fingers. With superhuman effort, she caught it and returned it to place. Fear hit her chest like a hammer. If she had lost that tool, the operation would have ended instantly. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to find calm in the middle of chaos. Her body trembled, yes, but her hands stayed steady. That was the difference. She had learned to separate fatigue from precision, to let her muscles ache while her mind stayed in control. She remembered long nights of hospital shifts, when exhaustion made her stumble, but she still had to inject a perfect dose or hold a life in emergencies. Those moments had prepared her for this, though none had ever been this extreme. Even fear became fuel. Every time she thought she might fail, she pictured her son's smile, heard his laughter, remembered him running into her arms. That memory gave her invisible strength. What held her up wasn't only skill, it was pure love turned into energy. Inside the cabin, the pilot glanced back. He couldn't believe she was still holding on. The helicopter itself was barely stable. Yet this woman clung to her duty as if danger didn't exist. In his thoughts, though he didn't say it out loud, he repeated what everyone else felt. They were witnessing something beyond human. The monitor's beep stretched long and threatening. The boy's heart was close to stopping. She clenched her teeth, ignored the fire in her arms, and placed another stitch with exact precision. "Hold on," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Her body trembled without pause, but her hands, miraculously, did not fail. It was as if an invisible force guided every stitch. And in that impossible balance, between exhaustion and precision, between fear and determination, she kept fighting. Hanging in the air, held by a rope and by unbreakable love, she went on resisting. The air inside the helicopter was impossible to breathe. Every member of the team held their breath in short bursts, as if that could help keep the boy alive. The irregular beep of the monitor marked the heart's weakness, while the shaking fuselage reminded them the storm was far from over. The mother nurse, hanging from the rope, kept her focus sharp. Her hands moved with precision, stitch after stitch, until exhaustion struck at the worst possible moment. She had picked up a clamp to hold a small blood vessel, a delicate movement that demanded strength and control. But the mix of sweat and rain on her gloves made the metal slip slightly. Just for a second, a tiny slip, but enough for the clamp to fall from her hand and disappear into the storm below. The metallic sound vanished into the wind. For a moment, the world stopped. The nurse felt an empty drop in her chest, as if hope itself had fallen with the tool. The doctor gasped from the hatch. "No! The young nurse inside the cabin turned pale, pressing her hands against her mouth to hold back a scream. The paramedic's eyes widened. He knew at once how serious it was. That clamp was vital to stop bleeding where she was working. The monitor let out a long, alarming beep. The boy's heart reacted instantly, life slipping away faster without the right tool. The nurse, suspended in the air, clenched her teeth and shouted, "Another clamp now!" The doctor searched frantically on the tray. There was only one spare, larger and less precise. He passed it carefully as the helicopter shook violently. She caught it mid-air with instinctive speed, refusing to let the same mistake happen twice. There was no room for panic, but losing the first instrument left a scar in her heart. For a moment, raw human fragility showed itself. Even the strongest could fail, and here, a single mistake could mean the difference between life and death. With the bigger clamp in her hand, clumsy, harder to handle, she pressed on. The wind swung her, but her hands found precision again. She gripped the vessel firmly and stopped the bleed. The monitor's beep, still faint, confirmed resistance remained. The doctor exhaled in relief, though his eyes stayed full of fear. "You recovered it," he murmured, almost to himself. The young nurse let out a sob of relief, while the paramedic clutched the remaining tools with renewed strength. None of them wanted to repeat that moment. The mother nurse, however, gave herself no pause. She couldn't celebrate. She knew failure was always waiting. The rope could slip, the wind could rip another tool away, the helicopter could jolt again at any second. Everything was fragile, unstable. But in that chaos there was one constant: her will not to surrender. She glanced briefly at her son's pale face, still under the faint anesthesia. That sight brought her back to the mission. She forced herself to erase the mistake, to forget the sound of the clamp disappearing into the void. Inside, a voice repeated firmly, "There will be no second failure. I won't allow it." The pilot, watching through the mirrors, spoke for the first time in a long while. "Hold tight. The worst is still ahead." His words were not a threat, but a warning that the storm had not yet shown its full power. The lost clamp had been a cruel reminder. They were walking a razor-thin line, and any slip could end everything. But the woman, hanging in the storm, gripped the new tool and returned to stitching her son's life. The mistake had almost destroyed it all, but it had also made her stronger. Now she knew that even against the storm, the vertigo, and her own flaws, she could still endure. The sound of the clamp falling into the void still echoed in everyone's minds. Losing it had been a brutal reminder of how fragile the situation was. For a few seconds, fear took over the cabin, but the mother nurse managed to regain control with the spare tool. Even so, everyone knew she could not carry the whole procedure alone. Her focus and strength were remarkable, but the human limit was far too close. That was when unexpected help appeared. The doctor, who until then had acted only as an assistant, made a decision. Leaning out of the hatch, secured by another harness, he stretched his arms toward the nurse hanging on the rope. He could not replace her, but he could guide her, hold the tools more firmly, and anticipate her movements. His words were short, but clear. "I'll hold the clamps. You focus on stitching." She glanced at him briefly and nodded. She was grateful, even if she didn't say it. Every muscle in her body screamed for relief, and his support gave her enough space to breathe and stay focused. The young nurse, who until then had only passed gauze and watched the monitor, also stepped forward. She tied her safety belt tightly to a sidebar and kneeled next to the improvised stretcher. From there, she held the boy's head steady and carefully wiped away every drop of blood that blurred the view. Her hands trembled, but she managed to steady herself. Her voice, once weak with fear, now became a steady echo of support. "The pulse is still there. He's still with us." The paramedic, seeing how every small effort helped, leaned forward and pressed the metal tray to the floor with all his weight. He knew if another tool slipped into the void, there would be no second chance. He also began arranging the instruments in the order she would need them, preparing everything so nothing would be lost in the chaos. The pilot, though unable to leave the controls, decided to add his voice. Through the shaking and the roar, he shouted above the storm, "I'll keep this helicopter as steady as I can. Hold on. You can do this." Those simple words were like a surge of energy. It was no longer just the mother fighting for her son's life. It was an entire team united against the storm, against gravity, against fate. Every voice, every hand, every effort became an invisible support holding her in the air. The nurse felt the weight was no longer hers alone. Her hands stayed steady, but now there were other hands supporting, other voices guiding, other eyes watching closely. She was not alone, and in that teamwork, she found new strength. The exhaustion was still there, the fear too, but lighter than before. As she stitched with the needle, she followed the doctor's calm instructions. "Higher now, tighten, good right there." The young nurse's steady voice added, "Pressure's improving a bit, don't stop." And the paramedic, with quiet determination, said, "Everything's set. Nothing's moving from here." That net of support changed the atmosphere. They were no longer passive witnesses. They were part of the fight. The helicopter kept shaking, the storm kept roaring, but inside a circle of resistance had formed. They were a small, improvised army with a single goal, to protect a child's life. Lightning lit the cabin, and for a second they all saw the same image. The woman hanging, working with precision, surrounded by helping hands and guiding voices. It was a moment of complete unity, a reminder that even in the impossible, humanity shines brightest when it stands together. With tears in her eyes, she understood. She had started this battle alone, but she wasn't alone anymore. That unexpected help became the key to carrying on, the spark that kept exhaustion from defeating her. The helicopter stayed suspended in the storm, fighting winds that refused to stop. Inside, each person held on to their role. The doctor assisting with precision, the young nurse cleaning and watching the monitor, the paramedic securing the tools, and the pilot struggling to keep the aircraft steady. But there was an invisible, relentless enemy none of them could control: gravity. For the mother nurse, hanging from the rope, gravity had become her worst threat. Every shake of the helicopter swung her like a pendulum over the void. The smallest mistake could make the scalpel slip, the needle pierce the wrong place, or a tool fall into the abyss. It wasn't only the risk of her falling. It was the constant danger that one wrong move could end her son's life. Sweat mixed with rain soaked her hands. Even through the gloves, the instruments felt as heavy as lead. Her arms burned, her shoulders screamed in pain, and her fingers barely answered to the rhythm she demanded. Each stitch was a battle, against fatigue and against the invisible force pulling her down. A sudden jolt threw her to the left. The rope snapped tight, spinning her sharply. The needle nearly pierced the wrong spot, but with quick reflex she stopped herself. The monitor beeped irregularly, and the young nurse cried out in alarm. "Careful! The heart rate is dropping!" The boy's heart reacted dangerously to the sudden movement. The mother nurse closed her eyes for a second, steadied her breathing, and set the needle back in place. The world outside was chaos, but she had to create calm within it. The doctor tried to stabilize her, gripping her harness to add counterweight from the hatch. "Focus! I've got you!" The paramedic muttered through clenched teeth, almost swallowed by the noise. 1 second more and we would have lost him. The pilot, fighting to hold the aircraft steady, shouted from the cockpit, "The wind won't give up, but I'll keep us in the air." Every second became a deadly edge. Gravity, joined with the void, waited for any mistake. There was no pause, no rest. The rope holding her was her salvation, but also her source of instability. Vertigo tried to invade her mind, reminding her of the hundreds of meters of freefall below. But she refused to give it space. She forced her eyes forward, only on her son's open chest. As she continued suturing, she thought of how fragile it all was. One thread held the harness keeping her alive. Another thread stitched her son's heart together. In both cases, the smallest failure would be irreversible. 2 lives hung from fibers as thin as promises. And yet, those fibers were all they needed to endure. Gravity pressed on her emotions too. She felt the weight of duty and love crushing her chest like a stone. Exhaustion made her doubt her own strength. But each time she thought of stopping, she looked at her son's pale face and found new strength. There was no room for failure. The doctor watched in awe. Even hanging, swinging, and pushed to her physical limit, her hands stayed steady. It was as if gravity itself tried to defeat her, but she refused to give in. The young nurse, inspired, pressed the gauze tighter, convinced they could not fail. The paramedic, holding back tears, thought he would never again see something so extraordinary. The monitor's beeping grew stable again, though faint. That meant the heart was holding on, that the work was helping. No one breathed in relief. They knew the fight wasn't over. Gravity was still there, invisible and constant, waiting for the moment their human strength would break. But the mother nurse, clinging to the rope and to her love, chose not to give in. Her body could tremble, her muscles could burn, the storm could roar outside. But her hands would stay steady until the very end. The helicopter kept fighting the storm, each jolt a reminder of how fragile everything inside was. The mother nurse, hanging from the rope, was finishing the final sutures of the most delicate part of the procedure. The portable monitor kept giving weak, but steady beeps. Each sound was like a lighthouse in the dark, a sign there was still life. Then it happened, the sound no one wanted to hear. The beep stretched into one long, flat line. The screen showed no movement. The boy's heart had stopped. For an instant, everything froze. The roar of the helicopter, the thunder, the whistling wind, all seemed to disappear under the weight of that impossible silence. A silence louder than any noise. Inside the cabin, eyes widened in horror. The young nurse let out a strangled cry. The paramedic froze. The doctor clenched his teeth with rage, as if trying to fight the inevitable. The mother nurse felt a blow in her chest, stronger than any gust of wind. Time stopped for her. She saw her son's pale, still face, and for a second her whole world collapsed. But she refused to give in to fear. That silence could not be the end. Her mind filled with memories, promises, laughter, nights of fever when she held him close, afternoons at the park, the words, "You always take care of me." All of it came back with brutal clarity. His heartbeat could not die here, suspended in the air, in the middle of a storm. Not while she was still alive. The doctor shouted, "We've lost him." But she cut him off, her voice rising from the deepest part of her being, louder than the blades above. "No, not yet." Hanging from the rope, with the helicopter shaking and rain lashing her, she decided she would not allow this to be the last moment. The silence of the monitor was not the end. It was a desperate call to fight harder than ever. The paramedic rushed to prepare the emergency syringe. The young nurse wiped quickly, clearing the view. The doctor reached for the portable electrodes, knowing they might barely work in these conditions. But they all understood. It would be her, the mother hanging in the storm, who would make the final move. With tears mixing with the rain, she pressed her lips together and prepared. The heart was silent, but her love still held him. That crushing silence had to be broken, and she would be the one to do it. The monitor showed a flat, cold line. The boy's heart had stopped. Inside the cabin, time became unbearable. The young nurse sobbed. The paramedic whispered prayers through clenched teeth. and the doctor searched for answers in the chaos. But it was the mother nurse who broke the paralysis of fear. Hanging from the rope, wind striking her and rain blinding her face, she placed her hands on her son's tiny open chest. There was no stable table, no secure operating room. Only her hands, her will, and the unbreakable bond with the child before her. "I'll do it myself," she shouted, her voice cutting through the deafening blades. The doctor tried to stop her. "It's too risky. There's no room. You could harm him more." But she didn't listen. She knew there was no time for doubts. Each second without a heartbeat lowered his chances. There was no choice. She had to start chest compressions right there, suspended in the air, swinging with every movement of the rope. She set her hands with precision over the small heart. The helicopter shook violently, throwing her to the side, but she steadied herself and locked her eyes on her son's face. She began compressions. 1, 2, 3. Each press was a silent scream of love, a challenge to fate. The wind swung her like a pendulum, every sway threatening to misdirect her strength. But she corrected instantly, fighting gravity to keep the exact pressure. Her arms burned, her shoulders begged for rest, but inside a voice kept repeating, "Don't lose him, don't lose him." The doctor, watching her accuracy, realized he could not stop her. He leaned forward and called out the rhythm with firm voice. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The paramedic readied the emergency syringe, holding it, waiting for her signal. The young nurse kept her eyes on the monitor, searching for any sign, any flicker that might break that cruel line. The compressions continued. The helicopter shook as if the storm wanted to rip them from the sky. But she did not stop. Every movement was more than medicine. It was a physical prayer, a desperate fight to spark life again. Tears mixed with the rain, running over the hands that pressed with all her strength. "Come on, son," she whispered through gasps. "Don't leave me now. Fight with me." The silence of the monitor was louder than the blades above. The whole team held their breath. Outside, lightning lit the cabin, as if the sky itself was watching this impossible duel between life and death. The rope swung her mercilessly. Her arms were about to give out. Exhaustion crushed her. But she pressed on. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Each compression was a strike against destiny, a refusal to surrender. The pilot, eyes locked on the controls, shouted, "Hold on. You're doing it, don't stop." The doctor joined in. Stronger, steadier. "Don't give up." She clenched her teeth, forcing every drop of energy left in her body into her hands. The world around her disappeared. Only her hands, her son's tiny chest, and the flat line that needed to be broken remained. For a moment, she thought she would fail, that everything would be lost in that crushing silence. But deep inside, something kept her strong. The memory of every promise, the certainty that it was not yet time to let go. And so she continued, again and again, holding on to hope as tightly as the rope that kept her in the air. The flat line on the monitor stayed there, cruel, endless. Every compression the mother nurse gave while hanging from the rope was a strike against that crushing silence. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The doctor called out the rhythm with a firm voice. The young nurse watched the screen with tears in her eyes, and the paramedic held the syringe ready. Outside, the storm roared, as if the sky itself refused to give them mercy. Her body was at the edge. Her arms shook, the rope swung her back and forth, and every jolt threatened to break her balance. Pain burned through her shoulders. Her breathing came in broken gasps. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Memories of her son's first laugh, his unsteady first steps, the nights she held him with fever. All of it came back to keep her going. "Come on, son, come back to me," she whispered, breathless, her voice cracking. Then, suddenly, a new sound cut through the fear. A short, faint beep broke the flat line on the monitor. No one breathed. The young nurse leaned over the screen, eyes wide. "There's activity!" she shouted, her voice a mix of shock and hope. The beep came again, louder this time. The boy's heart, weak but stubborn, had started to beat. The flat line filled with small peaks, shaky at first, but real. It was like watching a spark bloom in the dark. The paramedic let out a cry of relief. The doctor lifted his head in disbelief. The young nurse covered her face with trembling hands, sobbing with joy. Even the pilot, focused on the controls, glanced back and whispered, "My God, she did it!" Hanging in the storm, the mother nurse felt tears mix with the rain on her face. Every compression had been a battle, and now she heard the greatest reward, the irregular, fragile, but living beat of her son's heart. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't steady, but it was life. She kept going a moment longer, pressing carefully until the monitor showed a fragile stability. The heart was fighting, resisting, alive. A miracle was unfolding in midair, among lightning and howling wind. "He's still beating," the doctor confirmed, his voice full of awe. The helicopter shook with another gust, but no one cared. All eyes were on the tiny sound that brought back hope. Every beep was a celebration, every rise on the screen a victory. It wasn't just a heartbeat. It was proof that the impossible had become real. The mother nurse bowed her head for a moment, resting her forehead against the harness. She knew there was no time to stop, but she needed 1 second to absorb what had happened. She had brought her son back, right there, hanging from a rope in the middle of a storm. The whole team seemed reborn with that sound. The paramedic quickly set the tools in order. The young nurse wiped her tears and prepared fresh gauze. The doctor took up his role again with new energy. Even the pilot, feeling he had witnessed a miracle, held the helicopter steadier than before. The heart was still weak, but it was alive. That difference was everything. And in that cabin, tossed by the wind and lit by lightning, they all knew the impossible had just happened. Life had returned. The beeping of the monitor filled the cabin again, irregular but alive. Each sound was a breath of hope, a reminder that the boy was still fighting. Inside the helicopter, everyone let out the sigh they had been holding. The young nurse cried openly, the paramedic smiled in disbelief, and the doctor closed his eyes for a moment, as if he wanted to capture the miracle in his memory. But for the mother nurse, hanging from the rope, there was no time to celebrate. Her face was soaked with tears and rain, and even though her son's heart was beating again, she knew the battle was not over. His chest was still open, the storm still raged around them, and danger had not gone away. If she lost focus for even a second, that fragile heartbeat could be gone again. "We're not finished," she said firmly, forcing the tremor out of her voice. The doctor nodded, understanding. It was true. They had achieved the impossible, but the surgery still had to be completed. To seal the sutures, stabilize the heart, and make sure the life they had saved did not vanish in minutes. The rope swung her with each shake of the helicopter, every sway a threat. Her arms burned like molten iron, her hands numb from the cold. Yet she kept going. Her tears threatened to blur her vision, but she held them back. She couldn't afford blurry sight. She needed clear eyes, sharp focus, absolute precision. Inside the cabin, the others watched in silence. The young nurse wiped the boy's face gently, as if her touch alone could keep him alive. The paramedic prepared fresh sutures and gauze, passing each tool with care, making sure nothing was lost again. The doctor guided her with short words, keeping order in the chaos. And the pilot, though fixed on his controls, kept murmuring, "Stay steady, almost there." The mother nurse felt the weight of all their eyes, but she refused to let emotion take over. She knew that if she gave in to tears beyond the ones already falling, her hands might falter. So she clenched her jaw, blocked out the pain in her muscles, and focused only on what mattered, closing her son's heart with precision. As she stitched, one thought pushed through. He had come back from the edge of death, But that did not mean the danger was gone. She had to make sure the miracle held, that the tiny heart was protected to keep beating. The duty of a nurse and the love of a mother were now one. The cabin shook with every jolt. Lightning lit the scene with ghostly flashes, and the roar of the blades was deafening. But in the middle of it all, she forced back her tears, knowing that crying was a luxury she could not afford. The doctor, watching her, realized this woman was not only fighting the storm or death itself. She was also fighting her own instincts. The instinct to drop the scalpel and embrace her son. The need to break down and cry without stopping. But she chose the harder path. To keep working, to keep resisting. The monitor's beeps seemed to guide her. Weak, but steady. Each sound was both a warning and a promise. She listened to them, as if they were a metronome for her hands. At last, she finished another line of sutures and checked the repaired tissue. It was not perfect, but it was strong. Her son was still fighting, and so was she. She clenched her teeth to hold back her tears, knowing there was still work ahead. Hanging from the rope, tears running silently down her face, with hands still steady, she understood one thing. There would be no rest until it was all done. There was no victory yet, only a battle partly won. And she would not stop until she saw her son breathing on his own, out of danger. The monitor kept beeping, weak but steady, and that sound was the only reason everyone held on. The mother nurse, still hanging from the rope, had stabilized her son just enough for the next step, getting him to solid ground. But the danger was far from over. His chest was still open, the sutures fragile, and any sudden move could undo the miracle they had fought for. The pilot's voice, heavy with tension, gave the words they had all been waiting for. "We're going down." Inside the cabin, a reverent silence mixed with the roar of the storm. The young nurse clutched the portable monitor as if it held the boy's very soul. The paramedics secured the instruments tightly, making sure nothing was lost during the descent. The doctor placed gauze around the wound to shield it from movement. And the mother nurse, tears burning but held back, kept her hands pressed firmly over her son's chest, watching every stitch, making sure nothing came loose. Through the window, red lights began to flash in the distance, piercing the darkness, blending with the lightning in the storm. Below, ambulances and emergency teams waited with sirens blaring, a mechanical chorus joining the roar of the helicopter. The descent was rough. The wind slammed the aircraft, shaking it side to side. Each turbulence made the rope snap tight, swinging the mother dangerously over the void. The doctor shouted instructions. The young nurse held her breath whenever the monitor flickered, and the paramedic kept a steady hand on the child's body to stop him from slipping. The mother nurse, eyes locked on her son's chest, felt every second stretch into eternity. The deafening sirens below still felt too far away, as if the ground itself refused to come closer. Her boy's heart was beating, but faintly, and time pressed against them like an enemy. The pilot maneuvered with near superhuman control. "Hold on, we're almost there." The helicopter dropped through gusts of wind that seemed ready to rip it from the sky. The ambulance lights grew closer, brighter, until they filled the cabin with a red glow that blended with the storm shadows. It was as if the whole world had been painted red, the color of alarm, but also the color of life still fighting. Finally, the aircraft hit the ground. The landing was hard and sudden, but firm. The screech of the brakes mixed with the wail of sirens. The door slid open, and damp, earthy air rushed in to replace the storm's fury. In that instant, everyone exhaled at once, though no one dared call it victory. The mother nurse was pulled back inside the cabin, still clipped to her harness, still pressing her son's chest without pause. She had not let go for even a second. Her face was pale, drained, but in her eyes burned a light no storm could extinguish. "Move quickly," the doctor ordered, pointing to the ground team. Outside, paramedics climbed aboard with stretchers and equipment ready. The storm kept raging, the siren screamed, the air was thick with urgency. But the most important fact was clear. The child was still alive. The helicopter's landing was not the end, but the beginning of another race against time. The descent had felt eternal, because every second was a test of endurance. But now came the next step, moving him into an improvised operating room where they could finish what had been started in the sky. The helicopter had touched down, but no one felt safe yet. The boy's heart still beat weakly, and his chest remained open, held together by the fragile stitches done in the air. Landing was only one step. The final battle was still ahead. The mother nurse, arms numb and skin marked by the rope, was helped out of the harness. Her legs barely worked when she touched the ground, but she refused to fall. She stood firm, her eyes locked on her son. Rest could wait. He still needed her. Emergency teams surrounded the aircraft. Sirens lit up the night, and floodlights cut through the storm, shining on the muddy ground. A stretcher waited near an improvised medical tent. A temporary operating room built in a rush, holding only the bare essentials. It wasn't a real oar, but it was safer than a rope or the shaking helicopter. "Move the boy," the doctor ordered, and paramedics carefully lifted him. The mother nurse walked beside the stretcher, her hand never leaving her son's chest. Every step was careful, every move measured. The portable monitor still showed an uneven line, but the small peaks proved there was still life. Inside the tent, the change was clear. Outside, the storm roared, but here there was a tense calm, broken only by the hum of generators and the pounding rain on canvas. They had set up portable lamps, trays of extra instruments, and a small mechanical respirator. It was far from ideal, but it was more than they'd had in the air. The young nurse took her place at the monitor. The paramedic organized the tools. The doctor put on fresh gloves and looked at the mother nurse. Her hands were still stained with blood, but her voice was steady. "I'll continue." No one argued. After what they had seen in the helicopter, they knew she was the one who had to finish. Her son had survived because of her, and those same hands needed to complete the work. She leaned over his small body and resumed the stitches. The difference was clear. Though the tent was no real oar, there was more light, more space, and more support. Her movements were as steady as before, but now she had an environment slightly less hostile. Still, the danger had not passed. The boy's heart was fragile, and any mistake could be fatal. The memories of the helicopter stayed vivid. The rope swinging, the roar of the blades, the flat line on the monitor. Now, on solid ground, each stitch felt like an extension of that fight. It was as if sky and earth had joined in the same battle, and she was the bridge holding both. The doctor assisted her closely, handing tools and checking each step. The young nurse wiped blood carefully, keeping the view clear. The paramedic watched the oxygen and checked the pressure. No one spoke more than needed. The silence was a pact of respect, broken only by brief orders and the steady beep of the monitor. The mother nurse, exhausted but determined, felt every stitch as a message. "Don't give up. Stay with me." Her hands stayed steady, but her heart trembled. She wanted to cry, to hold him, to collapse, but not yet. Minutes dragged like hours. Outside, sirens and thunder mixed. Inside, the boy's small chest rose and fell slowly, guided by the weak beat of his heart. Each beep of the monitor was silently celebrated by all. Finally, with the last stitch, the mother nurse leaned back for a moment. She had closed the wound enough to stabilize him. The danger was not gone, but the immediate threat was under control. The boy was alive, breathing with help, his heart beating in the fragile balance she had protected, from the sky to the ground. The storm still raged outside, but inside the improvised tent the atmosphere had changed. The steady beeping of the monitor, though weak, had become a melody of hope. The boy's heart was beating, and his vital signs held steady with the help of the emergency equipment. The mother nurse, exhausted, could barely stand, but she refused to move away from his side. She had finished the essential stitches, controlled the bleeding, and sealed the wounds enough to keep them closed. The doctor, standing next to her, said quietly, "He's out of immediate danger, but we need to watch him closely." She nodded without taking her eyes off her son. Her hands were still stained with blood, her arms shook with fatigue, and her eyes burned from holding back tears for so long. Yet her heart was lifted by one single wish, to see him wake up. The boy stayed unconscious for several minutes. Each second felt endless. Each assisted breath was a reminder of how fragile his life still was. The young nurse held his hand gently, as if human touch alone could call him back. The paramedic watched the monitors, while the doctor adjusted the oxygen supply. Then, a small movement broke the tension. The boy's eyelids fluttered, trembling, as if unsure whether to open. The mother held her breath, leaning closer with a knot in her throat. And then it happened. His eyes slowly opened, faint but real. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Just one word, weak and fragile, was enough to shatter all the walls she had built to hold back her tears. A tear rolled down her cheek, falling onto his skin. She stroked his face gently, trembling, and answered in a broken voice, "I'm here, my love. I never left." The boy looked at her with difficulty, but his gaze was clear. His small eyes met hers, and in that silent exchange, all the sacrifice, pain, and fear of those hours found meaning. No words were needed. That first look made everything worth it. The others in the tent stayed quiet, respecting the moment. The young nurse cried softly, the paramedic smiled with red eyes, and the doctor stood still, knowing they were witnessing something beyond science. Even the storm outside seemed less threatening, as if the sky itself had given in to the scene. The boy tried to lift his hand weakly. She held it with both of hers, as if it were the most precious treasure. She could feel the fragile warmth of his skin, but it was alive. In that touch she found the answer to everything she had faced. The void beneath her feet, the swaying rope, the flat line on the monitor, the endless fight against gravity. It had all been worth it for this moment. "Rest now," she whispered. "You're safe." The boy closed his eyes again, surrendering to exhaustion, but with a calm expression. His breathing synced with the monitor's beeping, which now showed a stronger rhythm. The mother nurse watched him as if nothing else existed. And in truth, nothing else mattered. Outside, sirens still wailed, red lights flashed, and the storm kept raging. But inside that improvised tent, the miracle had already happened. A child had awakened, and a mother had kept her greatest promise. The storm was finally easing, but the echoes of what had happened had already spread far beyond the improvised medical tent. Outside, dozens of people, paramedics, volunteers, rescue workers, had witnessed parts of the scene. The nurse hanging from a rope, the impossible surgery in midair, the landing with sirens lighting up the night. No one could believe what they had seen, yet everyone knew they had witnessed something unique. The first journalist arrived running, camera in hand, soaked by the rain, trying to capture every detail. What he found was more than an emergency. It was a heroic act that went beyond any medical or rescue manual. The image of the mother nurse, still with blood on her hands, gently holding her son, became the most powerful picture of that night. Authorities soon arrived, alerted by the emergency team. Police chiefs, hospital representatives, even local government officials came to see what had happened. None of them had words. They listened to the medical reports with disbelief. A child operated on with open-heart surgery in mid-flight, with his mother hanging from a rope, and now, against all odds, still alive. Witnesses quickly began to share their stories. One paramedic who had held the instruments said with a trembling voice to a camera, "I've never seen anything like this. She fought the storm, she fought death, and she won." The young nurse, still with tears in her eyes, described through sobs how she had watched the monitor fall silent and then return to life because of that mother's hands. Her words were so moving that even the reporters, used to covering tragedies, were left shaken. Within hours, the news began to spread far beyond the landing site. Local radio stations broke into their regular programs to report what had happened. "Miracle in the sky," some called it. Others said, "A mother defies death to save her child." Social media filled with photos and stories from those who had been there, and soon the story crossed borders. Medical authorities also reacted. Some specialists, hearing what had happened, said it was an event with no precedent in the history of emergency medicine. Others, more skeptical, doubted the technical possibility of such a feat, but the testimonies were too many and too vivid to ignore. Meanwhile, inside the improvised tent, the mother nurse stayed at her son's side, unaware of the noise outside. She wasn't seeking cameras, recognition, or applause. She only wanted to keep him alive, to feel his breathing, and to hear the monitor beeps that told her he was still there. But the doors of legend were already open. Every witness became a storyteller of the impossible. Every word magnified the sacrifice. And little by little, what had been a desperate fight between a mother and death was transformed into a shared story. A symbol of resistance and love that no one would ever forget. Amid the media chaos, a government official approached the mother with respect. "What you've done tonight will be remembered forever," he said solemnly. Exhausted, she barely lifted her eyes and replied, "I didn't do it to be remembered. I did it because he's my son." Those simple, powerful words became the perfect ending to the story that was already traveling from mouth to mouth, from screen to screen. A mother nurse who, in the middle of the storm, faced the impossible and won. The sirens slowly faded, the spotlights dimmed, and the rush inside the improvised medical tent gave way to a tense calm. Outside, journalists kept reporting. Authorities gave statements, and witnesses repeated again and again what they had seen. But inside, in the small space where a child kept breathing with difficulty and a mother stayed at his side, one inevitable question rose. Who had acted that night? Was it the health professional, trained in emergency techniques, with years of experience and the Hippocratic oath engraved in her soul? Or was it the mother who simply refused to lose the one who gave her life meaning? She herself didn't have a clear answer. As she looked at her son sleeping, his face still pale but peaceful, she felt both roles had blended until they were impossible to separate. She remembered how she had taken the scalpel firmly, applying medical protocols with surgical precision. She had made decisions that any emergency surgeon would recognize as correct, even under inhuman conditions. That had been the nurse, the professional. But she also remembered the moments when fear almost broke her, and how it wasn't the manual that kept her going, but the memory of her son's laughter, her maternal promises, that whispered word during his fever. "You always take care of me." Each stitch had not only been technique, it had been an act of desperate love, a cry from a mother refusing to accept death. That had been the woman who gave him life, and was ready to give it again. The doctor, sitting a few feet away, watched her with respect. Finally, he said what many were thinking. No colleague, no matter how well trained, could have done what you did in those conditions. It was your love as a mother that made the difference. She looked back at him, her eyes tired, and answered softly, "I don't know if I was a mother or a nurse. I only know I couldn't let him die." That simple phrase held the most honest truth. Maybe the question wasn't about dividing the roles, but about understanding that night they had merged. It was the nurse who knew how to open the chest, sew, and control every tool. It was the mother who found strength when her arms gave out, who fought gravity, who kept speaking to her son even when his heart had stopped. Authorities, in their reports, debated whether to highlight the heroic medical act or the superhuman maternal instinct. Journalists, writing their articles, searched for headlines that could fit the complexity into one line. But none of them could capture the full truth. The achievement had been both at once. The mother nurse, in her own heart, knew the answer didn't matter. She didn't want applause or recognition. The only thing that mattered was her son's gaze. Those eyes that had opened in the improvised tent and called her mom. That look alone had been enough to justify every sacrifice. Maybe, she thought, there was no need to choose between the two roles. That night, she had been both nurse and mother at the same time. And in that union, she had found the strength to defy the storm, gravity, and even death. She sighed deeply, gently stroking her son's forehead. She didn't know what others would say, or how her act would be remembered. She only knew she had fulfilled her most sacred duty, protecting her son's life. The storm was finally behind them. The sky, which only hours before had roared with lightning and wind, now began to clear. The first light of dawn painted the horizon in orange and gold, covering the mud, the ambulances, and the improvised tents with a softer glow. It was as if nature itself wanted to show that after darkness, light always returns. Inside the improvised medical tent, the nurse mother stayed by her son's bed. Her face showed the exhaustion of the fight. Dark circles under her eyes, pale skin, arms marked by the harness and ropes. Yet in her eyes there was a new calm. The boy was breathing with the help of equipment, but his heart was now beating stronger than the night before. It was no longer weak or irregular. It was steady, the clearest sign that life had returned to stay. The doctor came closer and checked the monitors. He nodded briefly, no words needed. They had achieved the impossible. The young nurse, who had been watching closely all along, let out a deep sigh as the numbers showed stability. The paramedic, sitting in a corner, covered his face with his hands and cried quietly. Outside, journalists kept reporting. Authorities gave statements, and the story was already spreading across the country and beyond. Some called it a miracle. Others spoke of medical heroism, and still others of unbreakable maternal instinct. Each version highlighted a different angle, but all agreed that night would never be forgotten. The nurse mother, however, wasn't thinking about headlines or speeches. All that mattered to her was the small hand resting in hers. The boy opened his eyes again, just for a moment, and gave a tired smile, as if he knew his mother had fought the whole universe to bring him back. That smile alone erased the weight of her fatigue. Inside, she knew life would go on. There would be days of recovery, sleepless nights, more medical tests, and maybe future surgeries. But she also knew nothing would ever scare her the same way again. She had hung between sky and abyss, holding her son's heart in her hands, and she had won. Whatever came after would be smaller compared to that fight. When she finally stepped outside the tent to breathe in the dawn, she found the sky clear. The sun was rising slowly, lighting the wet ground left by the storm. She took a deep breath and let the fresh air fill her. For the first time in hours, she allowed a tear to fall freely down her cheek. It wasn't from fear or pain, but from gratitude. The doctor walked up beside her and said, "After what you did, life will never be the same for any of us." She gave a faint smile and replied, "I wasn't trying to change the world, only to save my son." And yet, she had done both. She had changed the world for those who witnessed it, for those who would hear the story, and above all, for her son, who now had a new dawn to live. The sun lit her figure as she returned inside to be with him. It was a different kind of morning, not just the start of a new day, but the beginning of life after facing the impossible. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell, and give a like so you won't miss more stories like this one. See you next time!